Hello, this is International Trade, Section B, Trade Barriers lecture. Our prioritized standard is Economic Standard 57. Objectively, we're going to determine the pros and the cons of trade barriers and free trade. Now, despite the benefits of international trade, many nations restrict the free flow of goods and services through trade barriers, which are government actions designed to protect domestic industries and jobs from foreign competition. Barriers to trade are designed to make domestic products more competitive with foreign competition with many different types of trade barriers. One of those types is tariffs. These are special taxes on imported goods. So the logic of a tariff is you make a competitor's product more expensive because you added a tariff to it, and therefore people will be more likely to buy your domestic version instead of the international version. Also, quotas. These are limits on the quantity of goods that can be produced abroad and sold domestically. So if you don't want to have to compete against, say, Japanese automobiles, you limit how many Japanese automobiles are allowed to be within the country every 1 year. So therefore, you have to compete less. Embargoes. These are laws that cut off both imports and exports from a country. So you basically cut off all trade from the country. So therefore, you can't get any products from that country if there's an embargo. Cartels. This is an explicit agreement among producers to fix prices and share markets. So it's similar to collusion. The difference is this is wide in the open. This is openly exposed. Everyone knows this is taking place. In the U.S., cartels are illegal. Other parts of the world, not as much. For instance, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries are all the countries in the world that make most of the oil. So they actually came together at one point and determined that let's not compete against each other. Let's agree to increase prices at the same time so that way we don't compete against each other and we can still make tons of money off the stupid Americans. Also, restrictions of immigration. So when we limit immigration, then basically that is going to potentially help American workers not have to compete as much for jobs. And another trade barrier, controls on the freedom to exchange currencies. So some nations, here is China, they actually at one point in time put a limit on your ability to get their currency. So that's something that can be done. Now, the goal of trade barriers is for the foreign countries' imports to decline, yet see no actual decline in a domestic economy's exports. So a couple terms here, we want to make sure we know the difference. Imports, so these are goods bought from sellers in another nation. So things that are brought to you from another place are imports. As where exports are goods and services produced in one nation, but sold to buyers in another nation. So potentially resources that you might normally have that you actually are selling to people in some other country. Now, such obstacles to free trade actually distort the pattern of prices, production, consumption, and distribution of income in international markets. Trade barriers established to protect a domestic economy can at times hurt the economy that it was designed to protect. So, for instance, U.S. restricting importation of Japanese automobiles will encourage the production of American automobiles. So, therefore, the winner in the situation, American auto workers will have more jobs and higher incomes. So, hey, there is a winner there. Although anytime you have trade, you also have a loser. So, American consumers will actually pay higher prices for automobiles due to the decreased foreign competition. The fact that you don't have as many Japanese options anymore, which means you'll have to pay higher prices for those American automobiles. And also, American exporters to Japan may also then suffer reduced sales since Japanese consumers have less to spend on U.S. goods. So, like if you're Expo dry erase marker company, you want to sell your Expo dry erase markers to Japan, but they are working in a Honda factory that can't sell Hondas to the US anymore, so they might have less money to spend on your Expo dry erase markers. Now, because of trade barriers, patterns of production in the US and Japan may actually change in undesirable ways, with productive resources moving from more efficient into possibly less efficient uses. Most economists actually oppose the use of trade barriers and instead support free trade, which is international trade that is not subject to government regulation. Now, free trade among nations actually raises worldwide production levels and material standards of living. In the short run, some groups are actually likely to be hurt by the effects of increased international competition in a process that's referred to as, and we've talked about before, globalization. Now, globalization is the process where national economies, politics, cultures, and societies become integrated with each other. Now, some claim that globalization is responsible for much of the loss of manufacturing jobs in the U.S., which would be why many in the U.S. might actually favor trade barriers in the first place. So if we notice, this was when NAFTA started at this point. That's kind of when we saw manufacturing jobs start to decline. So with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement kind of ushered in a new phase of globalization, but we also see that we are producing a lot less now. With nations increasingly embracing free trade, labor productivity has growing importance not only in the U.S., but also throughout the world. All right, this concludes International Trade, Section B, Trade Barriers. Our prioritized standard was Economic Standard 57, and objectively now we can determine the pros and the cons of trade barriers and free trade.